We want to be able to use different types of fuel substrates. What happens is that most of us get stuck just using stored glycogen as a fuel substrate, and that is particularly inefficient because it doesn't allow us to go quite as long. It's a quick burning source of energy. This is why people are left being hangry, they're not satiated, they become tired after eating a meal, they struggle to lose weight. There's lots of signs that you are not metabolically flexible, and if you're only using one fuel substrate, your body is definitely not optimized.
All right, Cynthia Thurlow, what a treat. Welcome to the Commune podcast.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. You know, as I was saying before the red button in the sky went off, intermittent fasting's been a huge deal, a huge protocol in my own personal life. And I talk about it a lot on my podcast here in terms of a protocol that was central to reducing or reversing my prediabetes, almost really diabetic blood sugar levels. So I want to get into that. And I want to get into all of the nuances between intermittent fasting for men and for women. As I mentioned, I have an estrogen footprint in my household. Yes. I have 3 daughters. And so this is a topic that I think about. So before we dive in, though, you know, I loved your book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation. And there's a few myths that you bust kind of early on in the book. I think it's in chapter 1. And those are a good on-ramp into the conversation about intermittent fasting because they relate to hormones and other central players in metabolism, really. So I want to, maybe we can start there with you can help us bust some myths. So central to the fasting conversation is weight management. And as you point out in your book, we've got an obesity epidemic in this country. I think it's, you know, in the mid 40 percentiles now. I think 41, 42% for women and even higher for men. And forever, we've been talking about calories in, calories out. So is weight management based on calories in, calories out?
I think this is one of the most popular questions that I'm asked. And so I remind people that calories matter to an extent. So obviously, if you're looking at macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbs, fat tends to be much more calorically dense. So it does matter the quantity of fat that people are consuming. And protein and carbs are 4 calories per gram. Fat is 9. Alcohol is 7.
Aww.
Yeah. So helping people understand, I mean, when you're consuming fat, it is twice as calorically dense as protein or carbohydrates. But what many people don't understand, that a calorie is just a unit of measurement. And it's not to suggest that we shouldn't be conscientious about what we're eating, but there is more to play with weight loss resistance than simply caloric intake. There's a whole constellation of hormones that are involved that can impact our ability to gain or lose weight effectively. And so understanding that, you know, the gym bro science, I think about my teenagers that are very lean and they'll say, oh, it's easy to lose weight. And I said, you are 16 and 18 years old. You're very lean, have a lot of muscle.
Playing a lot of lacrosse.
Yes, lacrosse and swimming and weightlifting is kind of the basis of my brood at home. But helping them understand that you are very metabolically healthy at your age. So yes, you can manipulate calories in a way that you can easily see the end product of that. But most adults are not metabolically healthy. We know it's about 92 to 93% of us are not metabolically healthy. And it's helping people understand that, yes, calories matter, but not nearly as much as the gym bro science people would like us to believe. And so looking at sex hormones, thyroid hormone, leptin, ghrelin, looking at those types of hormones along with insulin, cortisol, glucose are all critically important when we're looking at weight loss resistance. So I always say calories matter to an extent, but there's so much more to weight gain and weight loss than just simply looking at calories through a narrow lens.
Let me poke at this a tiny bit more. Does the consumption of certain kinds of macronutrients essentially stimulate the production of insulin? And does the presence of insulin or hyperinsulinemia, for example, the high presence of insulin, what's the relationship between that and our ability to weight manage and burn fat?
Yeah, and that's an important question. So if we're looking at macronutrients, we're looking at protein, fat, and carbohydrates. Fat is the most negligible impact on blood glucose, and then protein, and then carbohydrates. And so helping people understand that if you're eating a piece of fruit that has some fiber, that's going to slow the absorption. You'll have less of a dramatic rise in blood glucose and subsequently to that insulin. If you're sitting down and having a bowl of ice cream, you're eating a loaf of bread, you're having a bunch of Pop-Tarts, I mean, those kinds of things are going to have a much more significant rise in blood glucose, subsequent rise in insulin to help bring down that glucose. So yes, the macronutrient lens is an important one, vis-a-vis looking at hormone secretion, and helping people understand that it's not just the blood glucose going up and how high it goes, because there's also parameters. I always say if you eat a meal and your blood sugar goes up by 20 points, I'm not really worried. But if it goes up by 40, 50, 60, 70 points, that's quite significant. But it's in the setting of high glucose, high insulin, that you're not able to access stored fat as a fuel source. And that's usually the distinguishing characteristic. So it's not just the blood glucose piece, it's also that high insulin. If it's staying at sustained levels, that's when you start seeing these diseases of metabolic disorders. And so helping people understand like what is the right way to eat so that you are maximizing or minimizing rather that sustained elevation in glucose and insulin as well. Because when we eat a meal, we expect our blood sugar to go up to a certain amount, 10, 15, 20, 25 points. When it starts going up much higher than that, and then you start seeing this, elevation in insulin that stays elevated for a sustained period of time, that's what we want to try to avoid. And that's what most people in the United States are walking around with. They have poor metabolic flexibility. They're not able to access stored fat as a fuel source. They're, chronically and habitually hungry. We'll probably talk about, what it looks like when someone's not metabolically healthy and what are their triggers, what are the things that keep them satiated or not, are they voraciously hungry all the time? And then helping people understand, like, how do we set ourselves up for success during the day?
Yeah, well, we can use me as our guinea pig. And I know that you also have very personal experience with this. And you talk about it in your book as you entered perimenopause and you had stubborn weight that wouldn't come off, and then, most led you to do a lot of this work. I know Ben Bickman is a big fan of yours, and he might have blurbed your book. I can't remember, but I know that he's talked about you. And, he seems to claim, and others, that you really can't burn fat in the presence of high insulin levels. Is that your understanding? That
is absolutely my understanding. And that's why I think it's so important. I think many people get focused on glucose elevation, but it's helping them understand that this hormone of insulin, which is not per se a bad hormone, in the setting of chronically elevated insulin, high insulin, that's when you start seeing these, hypertension, you'll see dyslipidemias, you'll see obesity, you'll see, diabetes, PCOS, et cetera, certain types of cancers. But helping people understand that insulin's not our foe, but unfortunately it's been kind of, in many ways, when you look on social media, we talk to individuals that have a cursory understanding of insulin as a hormone. I'm like, it is a pro-growth hormone. It is a hormone that we definitely want to be conscientious about, making sure that we're keeping our insulin levels within a healthy range, not just looking at them on blood values, but understanding if you sit down and every time you eat, you're eating, the bulk of your calories are coming from pasta, you're going to have a much more exaggerated insulin response than someone who sits down and has a steak with some broccoli. Right. And I think we would make the argument that, if you are thinking about meals and putting meals together, there are many, many ways to go about doing it, but there are certainly ways that you're more likely to be metabolically healthy if you're leaning into more nutrient density and less processed carbohydrate.
Okay, so not all calories are created equal.
Correct.
100 calories of black beans is very different than 100 calories of jelly beans.
Yes, the processed carb. But I would actually argue, depending on the individual, when we're looking at, certainly there's fiber in the beans. That's an intrinsically a healthy food. But if you're someone that's not metabolically healthy, and I like to kind of give an approximation of quantity of carbohydrates per meal. And so people can easily, even with a nutrient-dense food like a bean or a legume or, lentils, they can easily hit a 30-gram metric for carbohydrates very easily.
Very easily.
2 cups of beans is going to be quite a bit of carbohydrate, and not necessarily everyone can process all that in one meal.
Right. I also know there's like the thermic effect of food, particularly as it pertains to protein.
Yes.
So, maybe 4 calories in a gram of protein might kind of net out to only 3 calories once your body actually catabolizes that protein. So protein might be a more efficient food, or kind of maybe add less net calories on a per gram basis. So there's other dimensions to the calorie conversation.
Absolutely. And it's also, we know that protein tends to be more satiating. It's better for helping with blood sugar regulation. I think most people could easily eat an enormous amount of pasta in terms of quantity, but you'll get to a point, whether it's 8 ounces, 10 ounces, 12 ounces or more, you're going to get to a point where you literally cannot eat more food.
Yeah. That is actually the difficult thing for me, because I want to get more protein, and I'm curious on a kind of what your protocol is on a protein, like per pound of body weight, what you're trying to get. For me, if I'm trying to get a gram per pound of body weight, it's very, very hard for me to eat 160 grams of protein, because I'm just not hungry enough. So where do you land there in terms of how much protein you're trying to get?
I mean, in an ideal world, 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. However, for most of my patients, I will say to them, I want you to get no less than 30 grams per meal as a starting point. Yeah. And I want your feeding window to be wide enough to accommodate at least 100 grams a day. Now, ideally, it's helping people understand that my teenagers, your teenagers, muscle protein synthesis, they could probably have 10 or 15 grams of protein and it will stimulate it. As we're getting older, we need more. And so it's helping people understand you need a minimum of 30 grams per meal. And sometimes that's not as much as people expect it to be. I sometimes like to push it to 40 or 50 per meal, just for me personally. But that 100 gram threshold is what we're aiming for. And that could be 2 meals. And for some people, that might be a high quality whey protein shake if you tolerate dairy to kind of get those macros in. But, if you're not there already, it can be a slow process. And I don't necessarily think that's anything to feel badly about. I think it's more often than not, I'll tell people you need a 6, 8, 10 hour feeding window to make sure you get that in. Like, it's far more important that we're meeting those metrics than it is to have like a 4-hour feeding window. I'm like, well, that's great, but most people can't get enough protein in that 4-hour feeding window.
No. Yeah. Virtually impossible for me, and I think for most people.
Yeah, I definitely can.
Okay, that was myth number 1. Not all calories are created equal. It's not all about calories in, calories out. So number 2, I was born in 1970, so I grew up kind of under the potentially apocryphal myth that breakfast was the most important meal of the day. Don't go without eating breakfast. That's what my parents told me. That was the predominant message. What do you say about that? Is breakfast the most important meal of the day?
Well, I flip it on its side, and I would say breaking your fast is the most important meal of the day. So that could be at 10 o'clock in the morning, could be 11 o'clock, could be 9 o'clock, depending on the individual. What you break your fast with makes it the most important meal of the day. So I think when we were growing up in the 70s, it was cereal, it was toast, it was a very carb-centric existence. Yeah. And so I think now when I'm talking to people, I will say the first meal of the day is the meal that sets you up for success for the rest of your day. So it really is important that we're getting those macros dialed in. It's important for satiety. It's important for blood sugar regulation. And actually, we know we are much more insulin sensitive earlier in the day versus later. Right. So I usually advise my patients and clients to eat by 10. That's kind of where I say, if you can eat at 10, and maybe you're eating at 2, maybe you're eating at 6, you're probably going to be able to get your macros in, but making sure it's that 30 to 40 grams of protein, making sure, you've got your carbohydrates dialed in, and most of them are coming from, if they're having, an omelet and they're having some greens or they're having some broccoli, get most of your carbohydrates from low glycemic fruits, fibrous vegetables. That's really where we need to be focused. And helping people understand, like, protein is the thing you really want to use as a guiding principle when you are going from, 14, 15, 16 hours of not eating the first meal is going to be the one that sets you up for success. And if you look at the research on blood sugar regulation, if you sit down and eat a meal and the first meal of the day is cornflakes, Pop-Tarts, pancakes, waffles.
Dessert for breakfast, basically.
Correct.
Yeah.
You are more likely to develop hyperphagia. So you're going to be looking for more food throughout the day. Your blood sugar regulation is going to get started on the wrong foot, proverbial wrong foot. And you more likely are going to eat more food just by virtue of the fact your blood sugar is not properly regulated. So I find that if that first meal is really a concentrated effort, people do much better throughout the day.
Yeah, this was a big shift in my life. And I started wearing a CGM, as you can see. Yeah. And I know that, I'm not sure if you're wearing one now, but I know that you have, experimented with it as well. And when I was that guy, I was like, oh, well, I'll have a bagel. Bagel was healthy, right? And then, you'd see this big spike in blood sugar. And then what would happen? Big crash, and you'd immediately be hungry again. And so changing my break fast protocol was huge. And I'm glad that you said 10 and not like 12 or something. And I know this is somewhat bio-individual, right? But your cortisol levels are naturally going to rise in the morning. And that's adaptive because you got to get sleepyhead out of bed and get to work and, get your kids to school or whatever. Along with that natural cortisol rise, you're going to get more insulin sensitivity in the morning. So it may be that you're more optimally suited to actually metabolize food in the morning. But so many of us who do adopt an intermittent fasting protocol just think about it as, well, I'm just skipping breakfast. So how do you untangle that?
Yeah, I mean, and you're speaking to these chronobiologic rhythms that we have in our bodies. We know cortisol is highest in the morning, it ebbs and flows throughout the day, and is lowest at night, ideally. That's what it should look like. And helping people understand that complex interrelationship guides us throughout our days. And so we're also typically more active in the morning. So not only are we more insulin sensitive at that time, we're also generally more physically active. And so that's kind of combined with that can be very beneficial. I think when we're thinking about, marrying these chronobiologic systems that go on in the body, helping people understand that we have circadian clocks, not just in our pineal gland, but also throughout our entire digestive tract. It's kind of reminding our bodies it's time to get up, get moving, just like, getting sunlight on our retinas in the morning is suppressing melatonin, increasing cortisol. When I think about people having a meal a little earlier in the day, it's continuing to honor that cortisol rhythm that goes on in our bodies. Obviously, these things get disrupted when we're jet lagged, when we're, so many of us worked shift work for at least a period of our lives, but helping them understand that, by kind of honoring that daytime eating when it's light outside, not eating when it's dark outside. I know all my European friends always grin when they hear me say that.
Right.
But in terms of culturally, and even during the pandemic, how many of my patients realized that they did better, eating earlier in the day and not later, that they slept better, their blood sugar regulation was improved, they didn't feel quite so full, they didn't feel like they needed to take a nap after a meal. So I think marrying those two concepts together is an important one.
Yeah, I think this is where it's so important not to be fundamentalist or neurotic about protocols, because for me, I was like hyper 16/8 when I first started, but I also have 3 kids. I think you're about to hear them walk down the stairs here. And it's not very friendly not to eat dinner with them, right? So then my window was like 11:30 to 7:30 or something like that. But then, of course, I started to learn about, my body's more optimized to eat earlier in the day. So how do I actually balance an intermittent fasting protocol that's also like socially friendly? And so this is, I think, where like I just had to relax a little bit and not be super like, try to stick to a schedule, but not be like super neurotic about it.
But I'm glad that you came to that realization, because I think so many people, I always say like rigidity is not part of fasting. Part of the way that we honor our bodies is by ensuring that we are nourishing our bodies, emotionally, spiritually, physically. And so, even I myself, like during the week with kids playing sports, everyone's going in a different direction. On the weekend, we have family meals. And I will adjust my fasting window, my feeding window, so that I can ensure we all sit down and eat a meal together. Because I never want the message to be like, oh, mom doesn't eat.
Yeah,
I don't ever want that to be the message. It doesn't set up a good mirroring for my teenagers. And so I'm super sensitive to that. But I think a lot of people take fasting to an extreme. And I always say, like, it's free and flexible for a purpose. Like, you should be able to, whether you're traveling time zones or there's a special event or you want to be more present with your kids when they're eating meals, I think it is designed to be as flexible as we need it to be. So rigidity does not apply.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, it's like having a sort of a default setting where on a normal day, I will adhere to basic protocols. And what that seems to have led to is the flexibility to push the edges out when I need to. Like, my eldest lived in Paris for a year last year. Oh, and nice. Like, I overstayed my welcome with her many times. She's like, Dad, go home. There's like 5 baristas that know you by first name. It's like, go home now. But, you know, I went there and I ate some baguette and drank way too much espresso and stuff. But I had found this place of sort of metabolic flexibility that let me do that and then come back and be fine, get back on the program a bit. Okay. A few other just myths that I want you to untangle. So one is what you eat as important as when you eat?
I would argue that, unfortunately, I think what we eat is the most important aspect to whether we are intermittent fasting or not. Mm-hmm. And maybe in your teens, 20s, and 30s, you can get away with eating anything that you want. But I think as we get older, we realize that, things change and we do need to make some adjustments. So I would be the first person to say that the less ultra-processed food we're eating, the more nutrient-dense foods that we're eating, learning how to cook for ourselves, learning how to prepare meals is certainly really fundamental. Then I would tag in, when you choose to eat is secondary to that. Mm-hmm. Certainly I meet people that are an exception. They'll say they're still eating the standard American diet, but they're just eating it in a compressed feeding window. And I just remind them that at some point, that ultra-processed food is going to work against them, because we know even, from a research perspective that most Americans are eating ultra-processed food every day, mm-hmm. but they're consuming 500 to 1,000 more calories a day. Yeah. And so I think that what we choose to eat is the most important thing that we can do to support our health. Unfortunately, it's not a super sexy answer. I think people are expecting it to be something different.
Well, no, I think, this just makes common sense, although it's not always common, but that I think the big sort of awakening for me in terms of like our habits in terms of when we eat was I ended up like at a Denny's a few years back. We went to a show, we're out with friends. LA actually closes pretty early, so there's actually not that many places to go at 10 o'clock if you're going out with a group and eating. And there was like a sandwich board up on the wall and it said breakfast, and then served all day, but breakfast, like, dessert all day, basically. And then lunch, and then dinner, and then late night. So there wasn't 3 meals anymore. There was 4 meals a day, mm-hmm. right? And I was like, oh my God, we just never stop mm-hmm. eating. And we were talking a little bit about, there's this researcher named Sachin Panda who's done a lot of the research on fasting, particularly 16-8. And I think there was an in vivo like mouse study where there's 2 groups and they gave them the same exact calories, but one group condensed in an 8-hour window and one just kind of whenever in a 24-hour window. And there was significant disparity in the results there. Are you familiar with that study?
I am. And what's interesting is the other group was able to eat ad libitum. So at any point in the day, they could eat as mm-hmm. long as it was a certain amount of food. And so it just really speaks to the fact these kind of intrinsic biologic rhythms, and a lot of Sachin's work is around chronobiologic rhythms in mm-hmm. the body, helping us understand that there's a way to eat that fosters good insulin sensitivity, supporting that circadian biology. And then there's a way that is completely contrary to that and the detrimental effects that ultimately will have on our metabolic health. And so what I find interesting is it wasn't even a particularly compressed window. I think it was 10 hours. So what I would not consider to be a super conservative feeding time, but just having 10 hours a day of eating and then another 14 where you're not, that in and of itself. And if I recall specifically, these were individuals who were not metabolically healthy, but they had significant improvement in their insulin sensitivity and blood glucose parameters.
Yeah, and it seemed that the group with the restricted window either maintained or lost weight, while the group with the 24-hour ad libitum window essentially gained weight on the same amount of calories.
Right.
That's the fascinating bit.
Yeah.
So when you eat does matter, and what you eat matters. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, they go hand in hand. They start to realize, like, when they start being more conscientious about when they're eating has a large impact on the food choices that they're making.
That's 100% true. It's 100% true for me, because obviously you can eat 8 pints of chubby hubby in an 8-hour window, right? You know, I'm proof. I'm living proof, right? And you're not going to lose weight probably doing that. But, you know, there's this phenomenon called Hawthorne effect, if you're familiar with that. It's like, you know, when you change your behavior or when you observe a particular person under, like, essentially when you adopt a protocol like intermittent fasting, you are more likely going to change your behavior in terms of what you eat and not just when you eat, because you're making conscious decisions about your food intake, and you're taking something that's unconscious generally and making it conscious, and that under observation your behavior will change. So.
But it makes so much sense, because I think oftentimes good healthful decisions beget other healthful decisions. And so, you know, my family making fun of me when I'm eating a True Food Kitchen when I travel, I just remind them, I'm like, when I eat there, because I honestly don't eat out a lot. But when I eat there, I know that my blood sugar is going to be stable. I can make good food choices. I'm not going to feel badly. So that just further reinforces why I'm conscientious about, you know, if I'm traveling, that at least I know I'm going to get something that's going to keep me feeling good.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's move into intermittent fasting and the protocol itself. So at the very highest level, what is intermittent fasting?
It's as simple as eating less often. And it's assigning a time period in which you are not eating and assigning a time period in which you do eat. And it can be very, very flexible. That's the one thing that people like saying, oh, what's your favorite window? And I said, whichever one I can get my patients to commit to doing. That's really, it's that basic. So it's helping people understand it is not new or novel. It dates back to biblical times, but it really is defining a time in which you do eat and defining a time in which you do not eat, and helping people understand what defines a clean fast, because I think that's important, especially if someone is weight loss resistant, they're struggling with, getting rid of the pesky pounds they've gained. Understanding that a clean fast is going to, maximize your ultimately is going to maximize and magnify all the benefits. So clean fasting, as an example, is bitter coffee, bitter teas like black tea, green tea. And the bitter is important because it's polyphenols, which are actually signaling molecules, but they can boost fat oxidation. There's a lot of benefits. And then water. Obviously, water is very important. I don't recommend dry fasting. That's not that's certainly not like an entry level strategy to use. But water and electrolytes and like bitter coffee, bitter tea are really very, very helpful as a smooth kind of stepping stone. Staying hydrated is important when you're not eating.
Yeah. And as you point out in your book, I mean, this is fasting has its roots in virtually every spiritual tradition. Supposedly Muhammad received the Quran in a fasted state in a cave, in 600 AD. Jesus obviously went to the desert and was tempted neither by Satan or by lunch. And that became Lent, and the Buddha had a period of fasting before his incident under the Bodhi tree. So there's obviously, it's baked into a lot of spiritual traditions. But the other point that you make in the book is that it's really how we evolved, right? I mean, we didn't have an endless surfeit of calories on the Serengeti.
There was no Uber Eats. There was no refrigeration, helping people understand that if we were not able to effectively utilize different types of fuel substrates to fuel our bodies, there's stored glycogen, there's stored fat, there's, ketones if we fast long enough, but helping people understand that this is how we have evolved as a species. Mm-hmm. And it's important to identify that, because now we are not in a food desert, we are in a food surplus, and we are largely overfed. And it seems so completely contrary. I know that my Italian mother wouldn't let me leave the house in the morning without eating breakfast. And, there was the whole concept of we ate 3 meals a day. There were no snacks. My mother didn't allow us to snack. Mm-hmm. And now I'm very much a people watcher, and I'll travel, and I'm amazed at every airport you go to, without exception. I mean, you're just overwhelmed with food choices. Then you get on the plane and they want to bring out the bag of crap that they want to feed you.
My God.
I'm the one that takes the pistachios, because I'm like, okay, I may be stuck somewhere and might need a pistachio, but other than that,
you must take the pre-shelled ones,
yes,
right?
Yes, yes.
Otherwise, you're sitting there.
So that is like the only thing that I will take when the airplane hands out the bag of crap. Yeah. But I think on a lot of different levels, we've conditioned people to believe, and certainly healthcare providers are guilty of this ourselves, because I was certainly trained in a time when we used to tell patients they needed to eat to stoke their metabolism, mm-hmm. and how important it was to eat every 2 to 3 hours. And I cannot think of worse advice that I ever gave my patients, but it was what we learned as practitioners. And now I reflect back on that, and like, we have contributed to this problem.
Yeah, that was another myth that you busted in the first bit of your book. Yeah, it's, I have 3 kids. We travel all the time. Yeah, it's just culture at every turn attempts to hijack our biology, right? So we just, we evolved, as you say, as kind of these opportunistic omnivores, right? So, when there was food around, great. But then there would be a paucity of calories, particularly in the winter, but also at other times too. So we became metabolically flexible in relation to our environment. And that was adaptive, so we could use glucose substrates for energy when it was around, and like the figs came into season and it was like go crazy, put on a little fat actually, which was adaptive because the scarcity of winter was coming.
Absolutely.
Great joy, we got some wild game, which was pretty lean probably, but still fats, fantastic. We could use that for energy when we needed it. But now, of course, we live where we could just order up right now. Maybe we should just order up a summer squash in the middle of winter,
yes.
Or like at any time. So
yes, well, even thinking about back in ancestral times, that fruit was really only present in summer. We had more daylight, as you appropriately mentioned. People gained weight because they were eating a lot of the surplus, and then the rest of the time, you were oftentimes left to having tremendous food scarcity. And so talking about only the strong survived, but helping people understand that, before refrigeration, before we had all these grocery stores and corner marts and Uber Eats and all these conveniences, life was hard. People had to work hard to be able to make sure they had food. And it's very different now.
Yeah. Well, I'm writing this book right now called Good Stress. So it's like a lot of adversity mimetics, but, we evolved in stressful situations often. And we evolved in relation to those stressful situations, and our body became engineered such that, a certain amount of stress actually conferred great benefit, or like hormesis, for example, or is what we often call it. And so now, in order to realign with our engineering, we actually have to self-impose some of that good stress, and intermittent fasting, falls into that category, just to align the way we live with the way we evolved.
And I think it's important for people to understand that a little bit of hormetic stressor is not per se a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. It allows us to grow stronger, ideally. Obviously, there's different forms of hormetic stressors, but intermittent fasting is definitely a fairly easy thing to navigate once, people can get to a point where they effectively can utilize either stored fat or stored carbohydrates as a fuel source, then it's not quite so arduous. I know when I'm working with patients that are new to that, and maybe they are not very metabolically flexible, it can take, 4 to 6 weeks for them to be able to tap into that stored energy. And then they feel so much better.
Right. Yeah. So when you talk about intermittent fasting, and I know that you address some other forms of fasting too, there's like alternate day fasting, and I think 5-2 is a thing out there, but mostly you're talking about 16-8 or 14-10, in which you're condensing your consumption of food into that amount of hours.
Yes. And I think it just makes it easier for people. I mean, there's obviously more advanced strategies, but I always say before you get to doing, 2-3 day fasts, please master the basics so that you can do that successfully. And quite honestly, I don't per se think that everyone needs to be doing multi-day fasts. I think that has become, in many ways, it's like a lightning rod or, a badge of honor, like, oh, I did a week-long fast. I'm like, well, at the expense of muscle for a lot of people.
Right.
It's helping them understand, the law of diminishing returns. If you're someone that needs to lose a significant amount of weight, yes, maybe doing a 2-day fast may be very helpful or beneficial, get on top of cravings, help, boost fat oxidation. Having said that, when I'm already working with someone that is thin and they want to do these long fasts, I'm like, what's the purpose?
Well, let me ask you that, because there seems to be some disagreement out there around how long you have to be in a fasted state to trigger processes like autophagy or even stem cell regeneration, et cetera. So where do you stand on that?
Well, I mean, typically the longer you fast, the more likely you are to stimulate autophagy. We don't have any ways of measuring it outside of a lab, so that's number one.
Right.
But I generally remind people, 24 hours is where we usually see a significant boost. Do I think you're still getting benefits after 16, 18 hours? Absolutely, given how metabolically unhealthy most of us are. When we're looking at stem cell activation, certainly the research that I have read is looking at 3 to 5 days fasted. That
It's
may
hard.
not, correct. And for a lot of people, they get headaches, they don't feel good. Yeah. And so I always look at, what are some of the things that we can do beyond that to be beneficial if that's your intended, outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just a few more things on the protocol itself, and then we can get into the benefits and then some of the nuances between men and women. So is there an ideal window? And we touched on it a little bit before in terms of when we're more optimized to metabolize food, but is there an ideal window in terms of when should you have your first bite of food and when should you have your last bite of food?
Well, it's interesting. I always think about Huberman Lab because he's so big on protocols. I'm like, what was because that's usually what happens. Huberman Lab comes out with content and then people say, Dr. Huberman said. So ultimately, bioindividuality rules, but I do encourage people to break their fast by 10 or 11 a.m. So that they're then, moving into a situation where if they're going to do an 8-hour feeding window, they're finishing their meals by 6 o'clock at night. So that's kind of, maybe it's 11 to 7, 10 to 6, really dependent on the individual. I know when I used to work shifts, it would be nearly impossible to do that. And so I'm always sensitive to the fact that people that work shifts or work overnight, I mean, there's a lot of variability in what they can tolerate. But I think when I'm thinking about sustainability in terms of longevity of being able to consistently fast or at least have a fasting protocol, we're usually looking, eat earlier in the day, close your feeding window before it gets dark at night. That's kind of my prevailing, if we really want to optimize circadian biology, that's typically what I'm recommending, as opposed to, people that eat 2 hours before bedtime. It dysregulates their melatonin secretion. Yeah. They don't feel so good. Their blood sugar is still elevated when they go to bed. And that can set up for a whole constellation of side effects.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to eat my last bite of food 3 hours before I hit the hay. Don't always succeed, but that's my general rule. In terms of breaking fast, we poked at it before a little bit, but what should we be focused on? And, what's a typical meal for you to break your fast?
Yeah, so it's always focused on protein. We want to make sure that we're breaking our fast with protein, because then not only is that going to help with satiety, setting up blood sugar regulation. So I typically will say protein and a carbohydrate or protein and a fat. So it could start with, some people want to break their fast with bone broth. Some people aren't ready to eat a meal, and so they'll sit down and have bone broth. And then they're ready maybe to eat something in an hour. But lean chicken, poultry, fish, steak. I'm a big believer in having some animal-based protein and then some vegetables. Having said that, I have some patients that prefer to sit down and have a scoop of whey protein with some Greek yogurt, and then they want to add some berries or some nuts. And I'm like, that's absolutely fine. But again, it's the protein that's the unifying factor, and at least 30 grams of protein to break that fast, not just to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, but understanding that as we are getting older, we need more protein, not less. So if you sit down and have 10 grams of protein, I'm not telling you that's useless, but you're not going to get that bump in leucine threshold. You're not going to get that stimulation for muscle protein synthesis, and we don't want to lose muscle. Like, that is so, so important. And for anyone that doesn't already know this, the first site of insulin resistance in our body are our muscles. So that's why we have to really be conscientious about taking care of it.
Yeah, 100%. What about fiber in the morning or when you break a fast?
I think it's very, I think it's very bio-individual. We know that most of us don't consume enough fiber, and I have carnivore friends that would tell me that it's not necessary. I fervently believe fiber is important, not just for, acting as fertilizer of the gut microbiome, but helping with signaling molecules and short-chain fatty acid production. I would say fiber is important, yes, with the caveat of, as a particular individual, how much do you tolerate at once? So this is when, if I say to patients, have a cup of cruciferous vegetables or broccoli, not everyone can tolerate all that all at once. So maybe it's in a divided dose. Maybe you're having half a cup with your first meal of the day, half a cup with your second. I do like to get most of the fiber from vegetables as opposed to powders, although I'm not opposed to that because, there's a lot of resistant starch products out there that my patients will utilize in a smoothie that work very, very effectively. But fiber is helpful for satiety. It's going to help with blood sugar regulation. We keep going back to these central themes. But certainly, I like people to be able to chew their food, swallow it, because they get a different feeling of satiety than if they just have a shake.
Yeah, you mentioned fiber and its relationship to the microbiome. Maybe you could untangle that a little bit further, and the relationship sort of between of the microbiome and the postbiotics of these bacteria in our guts on our general well-being, but particularly on insulin sensitivity and metabolism.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I certainly didn't learn about the gut microbiome when I had all my medical training. It's really been the last 5 or 10 years that it's definitely having a moment. And the more that we understand and learn, the more I'm very focused and diligent about making sure that's part of the conversation I have with patients. So number one, the gut microbiome has a bidirectional relationship with our brains. So, we are literally what we eat. It impacts mood regulation. What's important to understand is there's keystone bacteria in the gut microbiome, and if they're not optimized, I think right now Akkermansia is having a moment. It's having a moment, but a very important keystone bacteria that impacts endogenous GLP-1 regulation in the body. So GLP-1 agonists are having a moment also as well. But helping patients understand that we make our own in our body, but Akkermansia is very directly involved with that. It's also involved with mucin production in the small intestinal lining. So our small intestine is only 1 cell layer thick. That's why if it gets damaged, it becomes hugely problematic, and leaky gut or hyper permeability of the small intestine is a real thing. It's also involved in short chain fatty acid production. And, this is helping people understand that we have prebiotics, probiotics, and postbiotics, and how they all work together synergistically to ensure that our gut microbiome, which impacts immune signaling, it impacts digestibility. What's interesting is the emerging research about what changes go on in the gut microbiome in women. So as women are navigating perimenopause and menopause, our gut microbiome starts to look more like a guy's. As we're losing estrogen, it has a profound, I would argue, potentially catastrophic impact on immune signaling and immune cell function. And it explains why women suddenly become more likely to develop autoimmunity. It explains why we're more likely to get opportunistic infections. Why, like when I went to Morocco with my husband, I picked up a couple friends. And by friends, I mean things that did not belong in my gut microbiome. My husband did not. And so helping people understand like how important that interrelationship is. But the gut microbiome is absolutely having a moment right now, and one that is important because not only can we support it with intermittent fasting, but but eating the right types of foods, having the right types of fibers, the right polyphenols, which are these signaling molecules. You have them in green tea, black tea, brightly pigmented fruits and vegetables. All of these things are very, very important, very potent signaling molecules in the gut microbiome, telling things to machinery to be turned on, turned off, that ultimately benefit us.
It seems as if some degree of fasting helps certain species of bacteria in our gut proliferate, but then is there a point at which a fast, once it gets 24 hours or later, can potentially be detrimental to our microbiome, because eventually they're not going to be sustained through exogenous diet, so they're going to start to eat away at the epithelial wall, and that can essentially create intestinal permeability, all this other kind of stuff. So do you have a feeling there of like, oh, okay, at what point is fasting potentially negative for the microbiome?
I think that there's a lot that comes into play with a question like that. I would say it depends. Like the typical clinician, it depends. I think if you're talking about an otherwise healthy individual who doesn't have significant shifts in their gut microbiome already, we know that when that period of fast, and whether it's 24, 36 hours, when you go back to eating a nutrient-dense whole diet, it has this kind of revitalization. Now, if you're someone that's already not metabolically healthy, and we know that you've got dysbiosis, which is this imbalance of non-beneficial bacteria in the gut, and then on top of that, you've got the double whammy of you're eating a standard American diet, you're dealing with chronic stress, you're multiple rounds of antibiotics, and no judgment, because I think most of us have had a couple rounds of antibiotics during our lifetime, but helping people understand that all of these things, poor stress, poor quality sleep, stress, standard American diet, antibiotic therapy, toxins we're exposed to in our personal care products, environment, and food, all of these things have the potential to damage that gut microbiome. So my answer would be it depends. I think that so many, because I look at so much stool samples of patients.
Lucky you.
Yeah, well, it's like I get the report. I don't have to handle the samples. But helping people understand, like when I'm looking at hundreds and hundreds of these a year, you really get some insights into like who's really consistently doing the work, and who continues to need support. And I do think the hormonal shifts that we see women as they're transitioning into perimenopause and menopause have a large net impact on that. So my answer would be it depends. And I would probably argue that depending on where a woman is in her menstrual cycle, it could also have a large net impact. We know that there's benefits from doing fasting earlier in the menstrual cycle as opposed to closer to menstruation. Women in perimenopause, obviously, there's a lot at play in terms of the degree of stress their bodies can manage and hold up, be able to potentiate throughout a longer fast.
Cool. Yeah, I want to get specifically into menstruation, gestation, lactation, menopause, all of that, and its relation to fasting. But I want to just touch on a few more of the potential benefits of IF. So we touched on this concept of autophagy before, and sort of cellular cleanup. Can you just help us explain what's going on there, and what does that have to do with IF?
Yeah, it's one of these lesser known and or appreciated benefits of intermittent fasting. So it's helping people understand we have mitochondria, and when we are in a fasted state, depending on how long we fast, we have the ability to evoke mitophagy, autophagy. And what this is really speaking to is getting rid of disease, disordered organelles like mitochondria, things that have the potential to go on and develop into disease. And understanding that after the age of 40, most of us have some degree of mitochondrial dysfunction. That is a function of aging. That is one of the hallmarks of aging, is that we have this reduction in autophagy. And so sometimes this is one of many reasons why people will have less inflammation. Maybe they have less achy joints. They may find that they have more energy relevant to intermittent fasting. And I think a great deal of it has to do with this byproduct of getting rid of disease, disorder, disorganized organelles, mitochondria, And I think that it's an important thing to understand. You'll sometimes see people talking about, are these the organelles or the cells that could go on and potentially create disease? Yes, the answer is yes. So to me, I look at it as it's like taking out the garbage. We're very efficient. We put garbage in the garbage can, but this is actually getting rid of it, taking out of our bodily house and making sure that we get rid of it. And so one of the key principles that I think is helpful for people to understand is, a 24-hour fast, an 18-plus hour fast. We're not in a lab. We don't know definitively at what point. Is it at 19 hours and 25 minutes? Is it exactly at 24 hours? The research suggests it's the closer to 24 hours is where we really see this upregulation. But given how metabolically unhealthy the population is, 12 hours of digestive rest is still conferring a lot of benefits. So don't feel like if you can't get to 17, 18 hours, somehow you're not conferring benefits to your body. You definitely are.
Yeah, I think, we tend to give our body this sort of monotone signal of grow, consume, grow, at the expense of repair and rest and restoration. And I think that's like the broader concept, whether it's 19 hours or 24 hours, et cetera, is that there are pathways within the human body that are growth-oriented pathways. We hear about them like mTOR, et cetera. And then there are these other pathways that sense nutrient scarcity or deficiency, like AMPK and other ones, like the sirtuin pathway, for example. Maybe we touch on that for a second. There was a kind of famous Australian biologist, this guy David Sinclair, who talked a lot about longevity. So he deprived yeast of calories for a while, and he's kind of put his thumb on this one particular pathway, the sirtuin pathway. So what's going on there, and what does that have to do with longevity and health?
Well, it's interesting because David Sinclair always comes up along with brilliant Walter Longo's research about, when we're looking at longevity, how do we make sense of this, and having fasting and looking at protein restriction and looking at longevity. And so I think ultimately it's coming down to, we are starting to see research emerging that's suggestive of when we are kind of upregulating these signaling pathways, that we are conferring benefits beyond just changes in body composition and looking at biophysical markers. And so I think where I depart from some of David Sinclair's work and Walter Longo's is about the protein restriction, because I jokingly say, and I say this with reverence and respect, that when I'm looking at some of the longevity researchers, they look very sarcopenic and very thin.
They do.
And so ultimately it's trying to decide, ultimately, what side of the fence are you falling on? And I'm going to lie on the side of, protein leverage hypothesis, and more protein is better and not less. But ultimately, when we're looking at sirtuins and AMPK signaling and understanding all these signaling molecules, it's really speaking to understanding machinery that's going on behind the surface. And I know that David's work has been looking at, animal yeast models, but it hasn't per se been replicated in humans.
No, not at all. You've mentioned metabolic flexibility a little bit. There's a friend of mine, Will Cole. You probably know him. He always refers to it as like driving a Prius, right? That you can switch kind of relatively seamlessly between fats and carbohydrates for energy use. This is one of the targets, right, of an intermittent fasting protocol. Is that
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
And it's really, and I love Will's analogy, but I think it's helpful for people to understand we want to be able to use different types of fuel substrates. What happens is that most of us get stuck just using stored glycogen as a fuel substrate, and that is particularly inefficient because it doesn't allow us to go quite as long. It's a quick burning source of energy. This is why people are left being hangry. They're not satiated. They become tired after eating a meal. They struggle to lose weight. There's lots of signs that you are not metabolically flexible. And if you're only using one fuel substrate, your body is definitely not optimized.
So take this kind of to the next logical place. We hear a lot about the ketogenic diet and ketosis. What is the mechanism here between intermittent fasting stimulating the breakdown of triglycerides and essentially getting into ketosis where we're using ketones and free fatty acids for energy? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah. So You have to get to a point where, we talk about stored glycogen, which is stored in our muscles and our liver, and then helping people understand that if you go long enough and you can, get your insulin levels down, you get to a point where you're able to free up fatty acids. If you're able to free up fatty acids, they have the potential to go on and become ketones. Ketones in particular can be diffused across the blood-brain barrier. And so we're looking at BDNF, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor. When people say that they have a tremendous amount of mental clarity when they're intermittent fasting, this is exactly why. This is one of those key benefits that's probably not talked about a great deal. There's ways to monitor ketones. Sometimes when people are just new to low carbohydrate diet. So let me back up a little bit. We know that when we are releasing stored glycogen from muscles, that we will actually, through natriuresis, through urination, we will actually release this stored water that's stored. And you'll lose electrolytes. This is sometimes what can precipitate things called keto flu. People will get headaches, they're tired, they don't feel good, they're nauseous. It's probably more a reflection of dehydration and the fact that they've had this loss of electrolytes through their urine. But when we're eating a lower carbohydrate diet, and the average American is anywhere from 200 to 300 grams a day, so it gives you a sense of when we're saying a lower carbohydrate diet, for a lot of people just being under 100 grams, under 75 grams a day, it doesn't necessarily have to be rigid and be under 50 or 30 grams a day. When you're doing that, it kind of sets yourself up for stabilization of insulin, and you will sometimes see these side effects. So when we talk about ketones, they can be measured in urine, they can be measured in breath, they can be measured in blood. There's ketosis, and helping people differentiate and understand these are different processes. Ketones, those are things that we can measure. And then ketosis is when you're at a point where you're breaking down these free fatty acids into ketones. This is when people will oftentimes find that they're able to go longer without eating, that their body can effectively utilize these, more sustainable sources of fuel over time. This is when the mental clarity comes in. They're not going to feel hangry. They're going to feel like they've forgotten to eat, which sometimes happens to me. Oftentimes, if I'm doing a series of podcasts and I'm one after the other, I actually won't eat because it allows me to have tremendous mental clarity. So these are different terms, but ultimately are kind of pointing in different directions. And not every person that intermittent fasts has to eat a ketogenic diet or necessarily a really low carb diet. I think it's very bio-individual. It's figuring out what feels good to you. I find for a lot of people, it is fun to at least attempt to be conscientious about carbohydrate intake, but it's very bio-individual. So not every person. I think there's a lot of misconceptions that if you're intermittent fasting, you have to eat a ketogenic diet, and that simply is not the case.
No, in fact, I've kind of moved back to the middle on this one a little bit. When I first started my intermittent fasting protocol, I did go kind of very, I would say, like plant-focused ketogenic, and then started to bring in some more animal fats, et cetera. And, because really what I was particularly focused on was blood glucose management. So that made total sense. But then, of course, what I saw was like this, tremendous weight loss associated with that as well. And I was, trying to like untangle why that was. And, we talked about, like, for example, how like AMPK and mTOR are kind of on this teeter-totter. Well, if you have low insulin levels, there's also sort of a teeter-totter with its kind of sister hormone on some level, glucagon, which will, and we hear more about glucagon now. Glucagon used to need a PR person. You never heard about it. But, glucagon, among other things, it'll stimulate gluconeogenesis in the liver, but it'll also trigger lipolysis and break down these triglycerides right into free fatty acids and potentially ketones. And I was like, oh my God, this kind of low carbohydrate diet in combination with an intermittent fasting protocol, like, whoa, I saw like pretty dramatic results. And so that was good for me at that juncture because I had some acute issues. But then kind of over time, as I sort of found my happy medium in my body and I became more metabolically flexible, as you say, I started to introduce more carbs in the right proportions at the right times, particularly like before I would go to the gym. That was just kind of like how I've done it. And I feel like, also like I'll have a tremendous uptake of that glucose very quickly, particularly when I'm, contracting muscles and working out. And so this is where I've kind of moved a little bit back towards the middle of it. So
I love hearing that. I too used to be, super low carb and never ketogenic, but I think I found that I'm very insulin sensitive, so I can get away with a bit of discretionary carbohydrate. And so, and especially now, it's interesting to me, really experimenting with different windows, doing less fasting. And I still fast, but it's more like digestive rest kind of fasting, and sometimes 2 meals a day, sometimes 3, seeing, what's my sleep, what are my Oura Ring metrics, what's my Apple Watch, how physically active am I? I think that the most important thing is that we continue to evolve. So the experiment of the N of 1, I think, is so beneficial. And so for me, a little more discretionary carbohydrate hasn't seemed to be problematic. There's certain things I have to avoid, obviously, but healthy carbs I do really well with.
Yeah. What is brown fat, and what is intermittent fasting have to do with a fat that is brown?
Yeah. So most adipose tissue is white. Yeah. And so through the process and through hormesis, you can actually beige, they call it beiging, but it's mitochondrial rich types of fat that then eventually can evolve to brown fat. Brown fat is more metabolically active. It's the type of fat that is, as much as we hate fat, and I say this from a woman's perspective, most women are like, fat is all bad. Helping people understand metabolically active fat is good because you'll actually boost fat oxidation. And I usually think about, beiging brown fat or, beiging fat over to brown fat, through cryotherapy or cold exposure, like those types of hormetic stressors. Perhaps a little bit less so with intermittent fasting, with infrared sauna or heat therapies. That seems to be where I see the most in my patient population. Have you seen a lot of benefits from brown fat with intermittent fasting? I haven't seen as much from that.
No. Well, where I saw like a lot of benefit and transformation just in my own self, in my own petri dish, which was the combination of cold water therapy protocol with intermittent fasting. And so like and this is why it's so great to talk about the mechanism and help people understand the mechanisms, because once people understand the mechanisms, they can play around and find the magic formulas for themselves. But for me, I started adopting a cold water therapy before I would break fast.
Okay.
And, then as I started to decipher why I was seeing such good results, this is kind of where I landed, which is like, okay, well, I haven't eaten in 15 and a half hours. And so I have very, very low glucose, right? There's a very low blood sugar. So then I'm getting into an uncomfortably cold ice plunge, and my brown fat has to then engage in thermogenesis to warm my body back up into that little Goldilocks zone, because there's always this like homeostatic drive to like find equilibrium. So then my body's like, great, it's looking around for an energy substrate in order to warm me back up, but there's very, very little glucose around. So what choice does it have?
Right.
It has to use fat. And so it was kind of the combination of those protocols where I saw a lot of result in myself.
That's awesome. I mean, it's interesting to me because I can always tell when I've fasted too long, like not intentionally, I get cold. Yeah. So for me, the thought of getting in something cold when I'm already, like I can feel it. I'll say to my husband, like when I go to reach for a blanket, if I'm working, I'm like, oh, I need to break my fast. So I think that power of the N of 1, and it's interesting because for me, I hate being cold.
Yeah.
So I've had conversations with mutual friends of ours about this in particular. I always say cryotherapy is enough for me. I think if I did a cold plunge, that would be too much hormetic stress. Although I like love and respect all the people that are cold plunging. I'm like, I do 3 minutes of cryo or 3.5 minutes of cryotherapy. And I'm like, I think the hormetic stressor for me is definitely met. So this is where I think bio-individuality is so amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm no friend of the cold, let's just say. But like anything, I've just kind of pushed the edges of it. And I'm certainly not getting in a 40-degree plunge, but, like a 58-degree plunge. Okay. But that's just a place where I saw some benefit. And then that opened the door to my discovery of brown fat. And I was like, and I can beige that.
Well, that's why
that caustic white visceral fat that's somewhere in there.
Well, it's funny. My husband and I, we have now 3 dogs, but we'll usually walk our 2 older dogs. And in the winter when we do it, we wear less outerwear than we normally would. And my husband and I will talk about, the hormetic stress of cold exposure. It's like, okay, I'm going to go outside with a hat and a very light jacket, and I'm going to shiver, and that's actually going to provoke, that same thermoregulation in the body, but not nearly like the cold plunge. But I look at it as that's like, the midway. I would say it's kind of like looking at extremes, like good, better, best. That good for me is perfect.
Yeah. What about some of the psychological benefits that you can get from a fasting protocol? What have you found there?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is one of those probably lesser known benefits, but this is why meditation and spiritual practices oftentimes incorporate some degree of being in a fasted state. I know, some of the high holy days in my religion are associated with being in a fasted state.
Sure.
And so it's really speaking to the mental clarity, that BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, being in that lowered insulin state where, your body isn't competing with trying to process a bolus of food and has a degree of mental clarity. So when I think about benefits that are conferred with a degree of spirituality, and when I reflect on, a lot of the practices that we undergo, and doing so in an unfed state allows you to be very, very clear and intentional about what you're choosing to focus in on.
Yeah, I found that, particularly in the early days of my fasting protocol, just because I was a disciple to this practice, didn't mean I didn't get hungry in the other 16 hours, 9 o'clock comes around and, I haven't eaten for a few hours, and I would, feel a pang of hunger. But then, of course, if you're committed to the protocol, you're not just going to mindlessly meander over to the cupboard and pull out a bag of chips. We don't have chips here, but still, seed crackers or whatever. And, in that sort of forced monasticism, what it kind of coerced me to do was to actually examine the nature of the hunger, the nature of the stimulus, and either identify it as kind of a biological need, like my body absolutely needs this, or some kind of emotional or psychological desire. And almost every single time it was the latter. I was bored, or, someone insulted me on Instagram or something. I don't know. Oh my God. I was eating my feelings, or there was some sort of psychology to it, and it wasn't really a biological need. And, what I found that over time, that really helped to create this kind of space, between stimulus and response. And that really spilled over into other parts of my life, and so this is where fasting became such a kind of potent psychological tool for me. Because if, like my kids try to aggravate and annoy me as they normally try to do, instead of just, yelling at them and getting aggravated, it would be like, no, wait, there's a space here that's available to you between the stimulus and your response. And so let's take a step back and kind of examine, like, what's the origin of their behavior, what's the appropriate response, et cetera. And so this is where I really have become a big proponent of it for psychological purposes.
Yeah, no, that degree of introspection. And I not jokingly say, you can intermittent fast from anything in your life, whether it's relationships or
Instagram.
Habits. Correct. And so I think we actually had maybe it was on Twitter, maybe it was on Instagram, but that was a post that really resonated with people there. I was like, you can intermittent fast from relationships, and helping people understand that degree of introspection kind of translates into other things. I think in many ways, as an introvert, intermittent fasting just makes me more conscientious. What am I thinking? What am I bringing into my, my mindset, or what am I choosing to focus and be intentional about because it's so easy in this, social media realm to be distracted by things that aren't important.
Oh God. And you're a self-identified introvert, is that?
I am totally an introvert.
Really?
I
only know you in the public sphere.
I know.
So,
and people are surprised. The two things that I always hear when people meet me, number one, oh, I thought you were tall, which I'm like, no, I'm 5'3". I'm not tall.
Really? Yeah.
Yes. But on stage, I must look tall.
Yeah.
So people are always,
You have an aura.
Yes. I have a strong aura.
Yeah.
And then people are surprised to know that I'm an introvert. And I'm like, oh, I'm a huge introvert. But I'm extroverted with for a purpose. It's always, if it's from the place of education, inspiration, if by sharing that other introverts understand that you don't, introversion doesn't mean that you, it doesn't per se mean that you don't enjoy being out and social. It's just you get stimulation from different things.
Yeah, I can absolutely relate. I mean, I enjoy being in social connection, but it doesn't necessarily energize me. I mean, I feel very energized in the moment, but then when I'm done, I have like a total crash.
Yep.
And I have to go cocoon out for a while.
Yes.
So I'm kind of, what I'm going for is like ambiversion. That's where I want to end up. It's like the metabolic flexibility of social connection, where, you can kind of jockey between extroversion and introversion.
Well, it's a form of hormesis. That's how I look at it.
Yeah.
This is my social hormesis. That's I look at it as, these are things I've committed to. They're good for me. They're beneficial. I will enjoy them. And then I'll go back to my hotel room and I'm like, okay. Then I'm not going to talk for 2 hours. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. True food kitchen. In fact, my kids and my husband make fun of me when I'm traveling. They're like, we know exactly what you're doing in your hotel room. I'm like, yes.
Okay. So there's so many benefits to extol here from intermittent fasting. I know we talked about a bunch of them. We probably didn't even get to all of them. I mean, I know that you talk about reduction of inflammation, its impacts on the immune system, et cetera, in your book. So people just go read that, read Cynthia's book. I do want to get to sort of the nuances and the differences between fasting as a man and fasting as a woman. So obviously there's significant hormonal differences related to menopause and perimenopause, obviously also menstrual cycle. They seem to gravitate towards reduction in estrogen levels, but that's probably not the only thing at play. So what's going on here? What are the differences and the nuances, and how does an IF protocol differ from between a man and a woman?
Yeah, I mean, I would say let's start with women at peak fertile years, so under the age of 35.
Great.
I think that we look at the menstrual cycle as a 28 to 30 day cycle. Day one is the first day of bleed week up until ovulation. This is typically, and I'm oversimplifying things, but this is when estrogen predominates, and this is our superpower hormone. It's the hormone that allows us to have, if we want to eat a lower carbohydrate diet or even be ketogenic, we can push our workouts. This is the time to be more intense in the gym. It's also a time, if it's appropriate for you, and this is a very big caveat, because when we're looking at women in their peak fertile years, even if they're choosing not to become pregnant, their body's exquisitely sensitive to nutrients and how frequently you're eating. So if we're looking at a woman who's 30, 40 pounds overweight, has PCOS, I think intermittent fasting in the follicular phase can be of tremendous benefit. If you're looking at a very lean, thin, athletic woman at that same stage of life, I think I would not be encouraging them to do intermittent fasting with any regularity. Maybe they're doing it once a week, and maybe they're doing it just specifically to give themselves a reset. After ovulation, we're really looking at when progesterone predominates, the luteal phase. And this is when I typically recommend women, lean into the fact they probably don't have as much energy. This might be the proper time to do yoga, Tai Chi, Pilates, less intense exercise. And they may need a little bit more discretionary carbohydrate at this time. And by that, I don't mean like a box of cookies. I'm talking about maybe they need, the 5 to 7 days preceding their menstrual cycle. They may benefit from 100, 150, additional calories a day from carbs. So squash, sweet potato, low glycemic berries, high quality carbohydrate, not a processed one. And this is when I really encourage women to not fast. They can do 12 hours of digestive rest. In fact, I think 12 hours of digestive rest should really be at the basis for everyone in terms of helping with metabolic health. Yeah. And then as they transition back to bleed week, seeing how, depending on how they feel, they can kind of integrate back into that. But really understanding that this is a peak fertile time. The body is exquisitely attuned to, the biorhythms, how frequently we're eating, the intensity of exercise, hormetic stressors, and helping women understand that their menstrual cycle is as important a vital sign as blood pressure, pulse, temperature, etc. So if you start fasting and your period goes away, that's a sign it's probably too much hormetic stress. Then we move on. Yeah. So then we move on to women in perimenopause. And this is 5 to 10 years preceding menopause. Average age here in the United States is 51. So we're talking late 30s, early 40s. This is when women might start.
So menopause average age is 51?
It is. In the United States. Yep.
And that differs around the world a little bit? Or
it can a little bit. I mean, there's some countries like Southeast Asia where they may go through earlier, largely dependent on genetics. So if your mom went through earlier, but if you go through menopause between 45 and 55, that's considered to be normal. Okay. So some women, I always say late 30s, early 40s is usually when most women are starting to see some signs of, kind of the beginning stages of perimenopause. Now, the same thing applies, except that women in perimenopause are a little less stress resilient. We have ovarian aging. Our ovaries are as old as we are. So unlike men who are replenishing sperm, I believe every 72 hours, women are born with a finite amount of eggs. And what harkens the beginning of perimenopause is this beginning of loss of ovarian function. So we have less circulating progesterone. This can show up with insomnia issues, anxiety, depression, and a constellation of other symptoms that can be related to the relative imbalance of estrogen to progesterone. And this is when I tell women, you're a little less stress resilient. We already know this. Your adrenals will kind of step in to support this, progesterone production when your ovaries are waxing and waning. But this is when sleep becomes critically important. So if you're not sleeping well, please don't intermittent fast. Stress is important to proactively address. Anti-inflammatory nutrition. Remember what I said earlier, a lot of women in their 20s and 30s get away with a lot. I certainly did. When I reflect back on what I could get away with. Sure. And you're in perimenopause, all of a sudden, gluten, grains, dairy, very individual, alcohol can become problematic. And then we have this combination of this with this loss of muscle mass. Sarcopenia starts in the beginning of our 40s. And so if you're not actively working to build and maintain muscle and you're losing muscle, you'll lose insulin sensitivity. So the same applies in terms of where in your menstrual cycle you want to focus in on if you're going to fast in perimenopause. But if you're not managing your stress, not sleeping well, and you have a garbage diet, it's going to be, it's like adding gasoline to a fire. It can be too much of a hormetic stressor. So if you're going to fast in your follicular phase in perimenopause, if you dial in on those things, it can be helpful. Same thing with luteal phase. And for a lot of women, because they have less progesterone and you've got this early ovarian aging that's going on, this is when women have more magnification of sleep issues. They may, be anxious the week before their menstrual cycle to a degree that it's debilitating, where they're just not sleeping well. And so this may be a time to have a conversation if you're struggling with these things with your provider. Maybe you need a little bit of oral progesterone. Usually they start around 100 milligrams. Then as women traverse, perimenopause, mid-perimenopause, and late perimenopause, and as there's more escalation and changes, we have some of the highest levels of estrogen in perimenopause of our entire life, which is unbelievable. And then you have this relative estrogen dominance because, you have less circulating progesterone, gets magnification, weight loss resistance, breast tenderness, crime scene periods, very heavy menstrual cycles, things that tend to take a lot of notice. But the beautiful thing is that when you finally make that 12 months without a menstrual cycle, get to menopause and men seem to have the easiest time with fasting. Right. There's less hormonal fluctuations day to day, week to week. Now for menopausal women, the same still applies. If you're not sleeping through the night, if you're not managing your stress, if you have a terrible diet, if you're not lifting weights, it's like adding in fasting can be problematic. So I always encourage women to make sure they're sleeping through the night before they start adding in intermittent fasting. But what's fascinating is if you look at most of the research that's been done on fasting, it's been done on animal models, men, and obese menopausal women. And then everything in between, there's not a lot. It's usually a lot of anecdotal, personal or professional experience. And so it's really been my experience that women at peak fertile years and in perimenopause, their follicular phase when estrogen predominates, that's typically when they have the greatest success with fasting. And then menopausal women, a lot less hormonal fluctuation day to day, week to week. So they generally do really well with fasting, provided that they're sleeping through the night.
Yeah. So interesting. So would you say that plummeting estradiol production is correlated with like insulin resistance, for example? Or
it's interesting. So when you have the beginning part of perimenopause, you still have ideally vibrant estrogen levels, and then they kind of wax and wane, usually mostly highest of your entire cycling history, which is unbelievable. Yeah. I mean, literally it's like the high, you look, it's like this high morphology. It's really a combination of things that impact insulin sensitivity. So yes, there's some degree of, at the tail end of perimenopause and menopause, that loss of estradiol signaling will drive insulin resistance, but it's loss of muscle mass.
Right.
It's the poor sleep. It's not managing the stress. It's all these things, and whether it's cortisol that's driving some of it. If cortisol is high, glucose is high, insulin is high, and helping people understand that it's multiple things. It's multifactorial that comes together. That's been my clinical experience, and certainly personally, experienced that myself. That it's multiple things coming together, but it's not just estrogen that can impact insulin sensitivity, but also changes in body composition can be related to low testosterone. A lot of people just make this assumption that, testosterone is just about the libido. And I'm like, no, it's motivation, executive function, body composition for women when they tell me they're frustrated with the, body composition changes that they're seeing. A lot of that can be testosterone mediated as well.
Where are you on some kind of hormone treatments, whether that's transdermal patches?
Super pro. Yeah. I'm all about helping women. And I tell women all the time, even if you choose not to take hormone replacement therapy, at least make sure you have a very lengthy discussion with your provider so that you understand your personal pros, cons, benefits. I think what troubles me the most is that I finished my medical training in 2001. That was right before the Women's Health Initiative came out. Yeah. And I watched all of my female patients be taken off of HRT, and my mother and all of her siblings, all my aunts. And now we have the sequelae of an entire generation of women that women are at less risk for neurocognitive issues until they go into menopause. And understanding that you have estrogen, testosterone, progesterone signaling in the brain, and how important those things are, and really understanding that our brains in our 60s, 70s, and beyond are made in our 40s and 50s. So I'm a huge proponent of hormone replacement therapy, and I personally take it, and it's made a world of difference. I can't imagine what my sleep would be like if I wasn't on HRT, and I feel like that's important to be transparent with your community. But I think that there's now so much good information that's coming out. Right now, a lot of they call themselves the menopause. There are a lot of the female physician providers they were on Capitol Hill trying to get the black box warning off of vaginal estrogen, of all things, which is so silly. So I think the tides are turning, and there's a great book called Why Estrogen Matters. It was written by an oncologist and a researcher. And even he talks about how his wife and his daughter both have breast cancer, and they were put on HRT afterwards. And so I think that there's evolving information, research, very suggestive of the importance of HRT. And people will say menopause is inevitable, right? Eventually we're going to go into menopause, but it's not optimal. And if you look at labs, like as an example, if I look at my lipids before I went into menopause and after, holy cow, I would not have believed it was the same person. And so it's, that loss of sex hormones has a profound, potentially catastrophic effect on our bodies. And that's why I think it's just important to have the conversation.
Yeah. So estrogen, it seems like it plays a very key role in the maintenance of lean muscle mass, in lipid metabolism, obviously in some degree of immunity, insulin sensitivity. So these are all reasons that women should consider this.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I just had a researcher on that was talking about, the thought process is, women go through this perimenopause period. They have very heavy menstrual cycles. What are they typically offered? Oral contraceptives, an ablation, an IUD, or a hysterectomy. And she said to me, when a woman has a partial hysterectomy, which means she still has her ovaries in, it hastens her going into menopause by about a year and a half. And she said, I didn't know this before, but now I do. And so I make sure all my patients understand that it will hasten, smoking, worsens ovarian aging. If you have an autoimmune condition, that can impact when you go into menopause. And so I'm glad that these conversations are happening. And you had asked earlier, what forms of HRT do you like? And so I think that when it comes to estrogen, I think that there's, let's talk about the FDA approved, covered by your insurance stuff, because that's important. There's a lot of compounded options, but they tend to be more expensive and they're out of pocket. So number one, there's estradiol patches, which work very effectively. There's micronized oral progesterone, which is very inexpensive, like $5 a month. There is no FDA approved form of testosterone for women, which I think is criminal. And so most women have to have it compounded.
Yeah.
And then obviously if the stuff that's covered, the patches and the oral micronized progesterone works well, then there's no point in having to do compounded. But unfortunately, I'm on the compounded stuff because I'm special. There must be some reason about my body. The other stuff didn't work. But I think it's helpful for people to understand there's a lot of different modalities for administration. There's some women that have troches, which are things you put in your mouth.
Right.
Some people a lot of women use vaginal estrogen. It really just depends on the individual and what they need. But I do find for a lot of women, the longer they go without hormone replacement therapy, it can take a couple months to kind of get those receptors sensitized again when they go on it. But I've had women that it's been life-changing for them.
Would you suggest that before HRT, you go in and do like a full panel?
I think that's reasonable.
And just get all your markers, all your hormonal markers, and then consult with your physician.
Absolutely. Because I think then you have something to look at. Like I can look at my lipids before and after. Yeah. And I mean, I just about fell out of my chair when I had a conversation with my own functional medicine doc. And he said, Cynthia, if I didn't know you personally, I wouldn't have believed these numbers. And I said, I know. Because my lipids were just, and it's not unusual to see lipid values change for women. One thing I would say is that a traditional lipid panel is looking at total cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL, LDL, but everyone listening, irrespective of gender, needs an ApoB.
Yeah.
It needs an LP(a). LP(a) is a one and done test. If it's not abnormal, it's a one and done. But the ApoB is very important.
Yeah, I'm finding that the ApoB is now included in more of the kind of run-of-the-mill panels now. But that's new, at least in my world.
Yeah, my previous life, I worked in cardiology, and so for me, we weren't talking about it 8 years ago, but now I tell every patient, I'm like, you need it done, and we need to know what your numbers are. And for some people, they hyperabsorb cholesterol, others hypersynthesize, and there's specific tests that you can look at that help determine that as well.
How do you manage your intermittent fasting protocol with resistance training? Because as we've touched on numerous times in the conversation, we're losing, about 1% of muscle mass per year, 10% per decade as we get into our 50s and 60s and 70s. That's just the risk of the all-cause mortality related to loss of muscle mass. It's not just sarcopenia, but it's other things that are related to it, becomes relatively severe. So do you... so for a while it was pretty en vogue to do like fasted workouts and things like that. Where do you stand in terms of the relationship between fasting and resistance training? Because I've read, or I've heard you talk about resistance training, so I think that that's something that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What I would say is, number one, this is again bio-individuality. I work out fasted because I feel good working out fasted. If you don't feel good working out fasted, then, have something small before you go to the gym. I think for me personally, the days I lift heavy are the days I will break my fast earlier. And I do that because I don't think the message should ever be that we're white knuckling fasting. It should always be that fasting should be relatively easy and effortless. And if it's not, then you need to check in with yourself. So yes, on days that I lift, I absolutely break my fast earlier. So I may eat at 9:00 in the morning. I may eat at 8:30. It depends on how hungry I am. And I always make sure I get that first bolus of protein in, which I aim for 50 grams. That's what I aim for in that first meal. And that keeps me really full and satiated for, 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah. I've been going recently for the non-fat plain yogurt. I know it's not what people always love. And obviously there's nothing wrong with like good, healthy fats. But if I'm trying to get that big of a bolus of protein and I'm having like a full fat yogurt, I will also be then taking in a lot of calories because of the caloric content of fat. So the non-fat, like organic plain yogurt has started to be a go-to for me.
And that's great. I mean, it's all about figuring out what makes your body feel good. Like for me personally, I can get away with more discretionary carbohydrate than I can with more fat because the fat, well, I do better with plant-based fats, but for me personally, if I eat a lot of fat, then I'm not hungry. So I'm just, I would say that is probably my consistent metric I'm very conscientious about, because just for me personally, that's what makes my body feel good.
Yeah. So I have 3 teens. And you have 2 boys, I have 3 girls. So, right. So, and your boys are, as we talked about, they're like, young Adonises probably, right? I can only imagine. And obviously the basal metabolic rate of my kids at this juncture is like pretty good. And they're active and stuff. So in general, is intermittent fasting just really not a protocol for teens or even people in their 20s?
Yeah. No, I think if you're still growing, and I think about teenagers and that their frontal lobe is not fully developed until they're 25. So I just think it's not, I mean, it would not be something I would recommend. I think that you could say, 12 hours of digestive rest. And I joke about this with my teenage boys because the amount of food they eat is just insane. My husband and I are like, what are our grocery bills going to be like in another 5 years when they're both in college? So to get to your,
still be getting the bills.
I know. It's never ending. It's like even looking at the college, like what is the biggest, meal plan that we can get for the 18-year-old. I'm like, yes, that's going to be important. But I think the message should always be kids and young adults. No.
Yeah.
I think that if you're concerned about your child or, there's a concern, 12 hours of digestive rest and adjusting their carbohydrates if they're open to it. But as you and I both know, teenagers have a mind of their own. So I would say like I can initiate a conversation, but it may be met with resistance. So I think intermittent fasting is a tool best left for adults.
It's a different kind of resistance training.
Absolutely.
Adults,
absolutely.
For adults. Yeah. Well, they never listen to you, but they also most often imitate you.
Yes, they do. And that's why I was saying, like, I will, when we have family dinners, I always sit and eat, even if it means I've like stretched my feeding window a lot to make sure I can do that. Or when we were on vacation, we were in Portugal and I had 3 meals a day and I came home and I said, I can't believe how much food I ate when I was in Portugal, but the food was phenomenal and amazing and delicious. And my kids were like, Mom, I've never seen you eat so much food. And I said, well, you're not with me all day long. But yes, you're not used to sitting down and having 3 meals with me every day. But I think it's an important message to make sure that what we're not teaching our children is to undernourish ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are you working on now? Are you working on another book?
I am. I literally submitted my second book proposal and it was accepted and I got everything that I asked for. So I said, be careful what you wish for.
I know. Now you got to do it.
Now I have to do it. So that when I go home, that is the start of this summer is getting that book with the proposal. Like the proposal's done and now my first manuscript is due in February. So I was like, okay, I have more time than last time.
All right. Can you give us like the tiniest little window into the topic?
I'm going to be talking about women of a certain age vis-a-vis the gut microbiome because one of the things that's, as I'm sure this probably happens to you too, you have the opportunity to connect with all these incredible individuals on your podcast. And I was able to put some things together that no one else was putting together. And so that was the pitch to my publisher, who was very excited.
Yeah, isn't that cool when you get to sit with brilliant people and you start to harvest little bits of information and then synthesize it into something new?
Yeah. And my editor was really excited.
Cool.
And my lit agent was really excited. Because I think, I would say over the last 8 years, really my focus has been on women of a certain age. And my first book, although devoted to women, was very nuanced on one aspect and one strategy. And so now I get to really synthesize a lot of very interesting information about the gut microbiome and why it's so important as we're navigating middle age and beyond. Like far more important than I certainly ever realized before.
Yeah. Yeah, I won't go too far on that, but I am curious, does the kind of mix of different strains or species of bacteria over time, does that change as women and probably men get older? Yeah.
It absolutely does. And it's interesting because women's microbiomes start to resemble men's. And that's, with the changes that are happening in perimenopause and menopause, you get some restitution, resolution, improvement with HRT. And so that's also something that's very interesting. Like there'll be an interesting story that will start off the book that will explain why it's very synergistic that, my story of being in Morocco and how sick I got and how that kind of interplayed with the juxtaposition of this book. I was like, oh, that's so interesting how life, presents itself as like, this is a gleaming example of what happens as you are navigating and traversing this time in your life, and what can make you much more susceptible to things that don't belong. Yeah, the things that don't belong.
Yeah, well, and it's amazing and to think about that there are these 39 trillion some odd non-human cells in your body that are just as much of a determinant of your health as your own human cells.
Yeah.
And so we're really kind of interdependently living in this kind of holobionts, right? It's like, and these things are coming and going, every 4 minutes to 24 hours. I mean, these things are just turning over, and they have so much to do with our relationships and everything that obviously that we're putting in our body, but even the environment in which we exist. And it's really interesting. Seems like off topic, but it's not really. We're big fermenters here. So we make just upstairs like our own sauerkraut, our own kombucha, and then we have this starter, like sourdough starter. And the sourdough starter itself actually takes on its own unique set of bacteria and taste per our individual environment.
Really?
Yeah. So we actually have this like little local sourdough fairy, and and she kind of has the parent starter. But as this starter kind of starts to go out to different areas, she's like, oh yeah, because of you and your family and the bacteria that you have and your pets and all this kind of stuff, your starter becomes your own.
Oh, that's so interesting.
I know, and it's so interesting. And so like, you'd have to be have probably a very fine sense of taste to discern one sourdough loaf from the other. But I think this is the fascinating thing about being alive, is that we share so much, and yet we're all individuals at the same time, and that the microbiome brings that into stark relief. Well, I'm so excited to have you back and to talk about that when you're ready for that.
I would love that.
And just thank you. You're such a articulate spokesperson. I mean, every time I've ever heard you on another podcast, and certainly reading your books, I mean, you're just a wonderful communicator, and I know you're helping a tremendous amount of people. So I appreciate you being with us.
Thank you. I take that to heart, and that's a huge compliment. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we'll do it again, to be continued.
Absolutely.
With the microbiome. Hey, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you'll love this one too.